The year was 1876, and the Dakota Territory stretched endlessly under a blazing summer sun. The prairie grass swayed like ocean waves in the wind, broken only by the dusty trail that snaked its way toward the booming gold rush town of Deadwood Gulch. It was a land of opportunity and danger, where fortunes could be made or lost faster than a gunfighter's draw. Sheriff Jake Morrison sat tall in his saddle, his weathered brown leather hat pulled low to shield his steel-gray eyes from the glare. At 28, he had already seen more violence and heartbreak than most men twice his age. The silver star pinned to his black vest caught the sunlight as his horse, Thunder, picked its way carefully down the rocky slope toward town. Jake had been tracking the Crimson Riders, a notorious gang of outlaws who had been terrorizing settlements across the territory for months. Led by the mysterious figure known only as the Shadow, they struck without warning, disappearing into the vast wilderness like smoke on the wind. Their calling card was always the same, a red bandana left at the scene, stained with the blood of their victims. As Jake crested the final hill before Deadwood Gulch, he could see smoke rising from the town below. But this wasn't the usual smoke from cooking fires and blacksmith forges. This was thick, black smoke that spoke of trouble. Jake spurred Thunder forward, his hand instinctively checking his Colt .45 revolver in its holster. The town of Deadwood Gulch had sprung up almost overnight when gold was discovered in the Black Hills. Miners, merchants, gamblers, and desperados flocked to the area, creating a wild, lawless community where might made right. The main street was lined with hastily built wooden buildings, saloons, general stores, a hotel, and the all-important assay office where miners brought their gold to be weighed and valued. As Jake rode into town, he could see that the source of the smoke was Murphy's Saloon, one of the largest buildings on Main Street. A crowd had gathered, and Jake could hear shouting and the sound of breaking glass. He dismounted quickly, tying Thunder's reins to the hitching post outside the sheriff's office. "What happened here?" Jake called out to Doc Henderson, the town's physician and one of the few people Jake trusted completely. Doc Henderson was a thin man with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. He had come west to start fresh after losing his wife to cholera back in Boston. Now he served as both doctor and unofficial historian for the growing community. "It's the Crimson Riders, Jake," Doc Henderson said grimly. "They hit the town about an hour ago. Robbed the bank, shot up Murphy's place, and made off with nearly $5,000 in gold dust and currency." Jake's jaw tightened. $5,000 was more money than most people in the territory would see in a lifetime. It was enough to buy a ranch or fund an army of outlaws for months of raiding. "Anyone hurt?" Jake asked, already dreading the answer. "Old Murphy took a bullet in the shoulder, but he'll live. The real problem is they took someone with them." Doc Henderson's voice dropped to a whisper. "They took Sarah Whitman." Jake felt his blood run cold. Sarah Whitman was the daughter of Judge Whitman, who had arrived in Deadwood Gulch just 3 months ago to bring law and order to the wild frontier town. She was also the most beautiful woman Jake had ever laid eyes on, with auburn hair that caught fire in the sunlight and emerald green eyes that seemed to see right through to a person's soul. More than that, Jake had been secretly in love with Sarah since the day she arrived in town. She was educated, refined, and completely unlike any woman he had ever known. She could quote Shakespeare and Emerson, but she could also ride a horse like she was born in the saddle and shoot a rifle with deadly accuracy. She taught school to the children of miners and merchants, bringing learning and civilization to the rough frontier town. "Did anyone see which way they went?" Jake asked, his voice tight with controlled anger. "North toward the Badlands," replied Tom Bradley, the owner of the general store. Tom was a heavy-set man with a full beard who had been one of the first settlers in Deadwood Gulch. "But Jake, you can't go after them alone. The Crimson Riders number at least a dozen men, all of them killers." Jake looked around at the faces of the townspeople. These were good, hard-working folks who had come west seeking a better life. They were shopkeepers and miners, not gunfighters. He couldn't ask them to risk their lives in a battle against professional outlaws. "I'm going after them," Jake said simply. "It's my job, and Sarah doesn't deserve to be caught up in this." What Jake didn't say was that the thought of Sarah in the hands of ruthless outlaws made his heart race with fear and anger. He had been working up the courage to ask Judge Whitman for permission to court his daughter. Now she might be lost forever. As Jake prepared to leave town, he checked his weapons and supplies. His Colt .45 was cleaned and loaded, with extra cartridges in his gun belt. His Winchester rifle was secured in its scabbard on Thunder's saddle, along with enough food and water for several days on the trail. The Badlands were a harsh, unforgiving landscape of rocky canyons and towering mesas that stretched for hundreds of miles. It was the perfect hiding place for outlaws, with countless caves and hidden valleys where a man could disappear forever. But Jake knew the land well from his years as a cavalry scout before becoming sheriff, and he had tracked men through worse terrain. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Jake mounted Thunder and rode out of Deadwood Gulch. Behind him, the townspeople watched with a mixture of hope and fear. They all knew that Jake Morrison was the best lawman in the territory, but even he might not be able to survive what lay ahead in the shadows of the Badlands. The trail north from Deadwood Gulch led through rolling hills covered with buffalo grass and patches of scrub oak. Jake followed the clear tracks left by the outlaws' horses, counting at least 12 distinct sets of hoofprints in the soft earth. The Crimson Riders were making good time, but they weren't trying to hide their trail. That worried Jake. It suggested they were confident they wouldn't be followed, or worse, that they were leading him into a trap. As the moon rose full and bright over the prairie, Jake continued to follow the trail. Thunder was a sure-footed mount who could travel safely even in the dim light, and Jake wanted to make up as much ground as possible before dawn. Every hour that passed meant Sarah was farther from safety and deeper into danger. The night air was cool and filled with the sounds of the frontier, the distant howl of coyotes, the hoot of an owl, and the rustle of small creatures in the grass. Jake had always found peace in these sounds, but tonight they seemed ominous, as if the very land was warning him of the dangers ahead. Around midnight, Jake came across the remains of a campfire that was still warm to the touch. The outlaws had stopped here for less than an hour, probably to rest their horses and plan their next move. Jake examined the area carefully by moonlight, looking for any clue about Sarah's condition. What he found made his heart sink. There were drops of blood on a rock near the fire, and a torn piece of blue fabric that Jake recognized as coming from Sarah's dress. She was hurt, but hopefully not seriously. Jake clenched his fists in anger at the thought of anyone harming the gentle schoolteacher. As he prepared to mount Thunder and continue the pursuit, Jake heard a sound that made him freeze, the soft whinny of a horse, coming from a grove of cottonwood trees about 100 yards away. Moving quietly, Jake drew his Colt and crept toward the sound. What he found there changed everything he thought he knew about the situation. Hidden among the trees was a single horse, saddled and ready for travel. But this wasn't one of the outlaws' mounts, it was Starlight, Sarah's own mare, a beautiful palomino that Judge Whitman had bought for his daughter when they arrived in Deadwood Gulch. Even more surprising was what Jake found in the saddlebags. Instead of the personal belongings he expected, there were men's clothes, ammunition, and a pair of well-used Colt revolvers. There was also a leather-bound journal filled with detailed notes about the movements of gold shipments, bank schedules, and the routines of law enforcement throughout the territory. Jake's mind raced as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. Why would Sarah's horse be here, hidden away from the main camp? And why would her saddlebags contain weapons and what appeared to be intelligence about potential targets for robbery? A soft footstep behind him made Jake spin around, his gun drawn and ready. Standing at the edge of the grove was Sarah Whitman herself, but she looked nothing like the refined schoolteacher he knew. Her long auburn hair was braided back in a practical style, and she wore dark clothing suitable for riding at night. Most shocking of all, she had a gun belt around her waist with 2 matching revolvers. "Hello, Jake," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying none of the fear he would have expected from a kidnapped victim. "I was wondering when you'd find me." "Sarah." Jake lowered his gun, relief flooding through him. "Thank God you're safe. How did you escape? Where are the outlaws?" But even as he spoke, Jake noticed that Sarah hadn't answered his questions. Instead, she was watching him with an expression he couldn't read, her green eyes reflecting the moonlight like a cat's. "I didn't escape, Jake," Sarah said softly. "And I'm not a victim." The truth hit Jake like a physical blow. "You're with them. You're part of the Crimson Riders." Sarah nodded slowly. "I'm their leader, Jake. I'm the one they call the Shadow." Jake felt as if the ground had shifted beneath his feet. The woman he loved, the refined Eastern lady who taught children and quoted poetry, was the most wanted outlaw in the territory. It seemed impossible, but the evidence was right in front of him. "Why?" was all Jake could manage to say. Sarah's expression softened, and for a moment she looked like the woman he had fallen in love with. "It's a long story, Jake, and I'm not sure you'll understand." "Try me," Jake said, his gun still in his hand but no longer pointed at Sarah. Sarah walked over to a fallen log and sat down, gesturing for Jake to join her. After a moment's hesitation, he holstered his weapon and sat beside her, though he remained tense and ready for trouble. "My real name isn't Sarah Whitman," she began. "It's Sarah McKenna. Judge Whitman isn't my father, he's my handler," sent by the Pinkerton Detective Agency. Jake stared at her in amazement. The Pinkerton Agency was famous throughout the country for their detective work and their efforts to combat crime on the frontier. Many of their agents worked undercover, infiltrating criminal organizations to gather intelligence. "We've been tracking a conspiracy that goes much deeper than simple robbery," Sarah continued. "There's a group of powerful men, politicians, railroad executives, mining company owners, who have been stealing land from Native American tribes and small settlers. They use their influence to change laws, forge documents, and when that doesn't work, they hire outlaws to drive people away through violence and intimidation. So the Crimson Riders," Jake began, "are working for these men, yes. But they don't know I'm a Pinkerton agent. As far as they're concerned, I'm just a clever woman who can plan successful robberies. The money we steal goes to fund their larger operations, buying politicians, hiring more gunmen, purchasing weapons for a private army they're building." Jake's mind was reeling. "But people have been killed, Sarah. Innocent people." Sarah's face darkened with pain and anger. "I know, and I hate every moment of it. But we've been gathering evidence of the larger conspiracy. If we can expose the men at the top, we can stop not just the Crimson Riders, but the whole corrupt network they're part of. It could save thousands of lives and preserve the rights of settlers and native tribes throughout the West." "Why didn't you tell me?" Jake asked. "I could have helped." Sarah looked at him with eyes full of sadness and something that might have been love. "Because I care about you too much to put you in danger. And because I wasn't sure I could trust you not to try to stop me." Jake was quiet for a long moment, processing everything Sarah had told him. The woman he loved was a federal agent working undercover to expose a massive conspiracy. She was also the leader of a gang of outlaws who had committed terrible crimes, even if it was for a greater good. "What happens now?" he asked finally. "Now you have a choice," Sarah said. "You can arrest me and destroy months of work that could save thousands of lives. Or you can trust me and help me finish this mission." Before Jake could answer, the sound of hoofbeats echoed through the night. Sarah jumped to her feet, her hand moving to her gun. "They're coming back," she said urgently. "My men are returning from scouting the area. Jake, you need to decide right now, are you with me or against me?" Jake looked into Sarah's green eyes and saw the woman he had fallen in love with, but also someone completely new. She was dangerous, mysterious, and working for justice in ways he had never imagined. In that moment he made a choice that would change both their lives forever. "I'm with you," he said simply. Sarah's face broke into a smile that was both relief and joy. "Then we need to make this look convincing. My men think you're chasing us, so you're going to have to be my prisoner." Jake allowed Sarah to tie his hands behind his back with rope, though she left it loose enough that he could escape if necessary. She took his guns and secured them to her own saddle, then helped him mount Thunder under the watchful eye of the returning Crimson Riders. The gang was exactly what Jake had expected from his years of law enforcement, a collection of hard, dangerous men who lived by violence and trusted no one. Their leader, as far as they knew, was the mysterious figure called the Shadow, who always wore a red bandana across the lower half of their face during robberies. None of them suspected that their leader was actually a refined Eastern lady working for the federal government. "Well, well," said a man Jake recognized as Bart Coleman, one of the most wanted criminals in 3 territories. Coleman was a tall, lean man with cold blue eyes and a scar running from his left ear to the corner of his mouth. He had killed at least 6 men that Jake knew of and probably more. "If it isn't the famous Sheriff Morrison. Shadow, you sure picked yourself a prize." "He was following our trail," Sarah said, her voice taking on a harder edge that Jake had never heard before. "I figured he might be useful as a bargaining chip if we run into trouble." Jake had to admire Sarah's ability to slip into her role as an outlaw leader. She carried herself differently, spoke with more authority, and seemed completely comfortable commanding a gang of killers. It was both impressive and a little frightening. The gang made camp in a hidden canyon about 5 miles from where Jake had found Sarah. The canyon was a perfect hideout, narrow entrance that could be easily defended, high walls that provided cover from view, and a spring that provided fresh water. Jake could see why the Crimson Riders had been so successful at avoiding capture. As the outlaws settled in for the night, Jake found himself studying each member of the gang. Besides Coleman, there was Miguel Santos, a former vaquero from Texas who was said to be the fastest draw south of the Rio Grande. Tommy the Kid Wilson was barely 18 but already had a reputation for explosive violence. Iron Pete McAllister was a giant of a man who could break a man's neck with his bare hands. The most dangerous, however, might have been Mary Cassidy, the only other woman in the group. She was a blonde Irish woman in her 30s who had been running cons and committing crimes since she was 12 years old. Jake had heard she once poisoned 3 men who had tried to cheat her in a card game. She watched Jake with calculating eyes, as if trying to decide whether he was worth keeping alive. "So what's the plan, Shadow?" Coleman asked as the gang gathered around their campfire. "We've got enough money to lay low for months, but I'm getting restless just sitting around." Sarah, still wearing her red bandana as a mask, consulted the journal Jake had seen in her saddlebags. "There's a gold shipment leaving Rapid City in 3 days. 2 wagons heading for the railroad at Prairie. Should be carrying at least $20,000 in raw gold." The gang members' eyes lit up with greed at the mention of such a large sum. $20,000 was enough money to make them all rich, at least by frontier standards. "What about security?" asked Miguel, his Mexican accent coloring his careful English. "For guards, maybe 6, Sarah replied. "They'll be well armed, but they won't be expecting trouble until they get closer to Prairie. If we hit them in Devil's Canyon, we'll have the advantage of terrain." Jake knew Devil's Canyon well. It was a narrow pass through rocky hills about halfway between Rapid City and Prairie. It would indeed be perfect for an ambush, with plenty of places for outlaws to hide and limited escape routes for their victims. As the gang discussed the details of the robbery, Jake began to understand the full scope of Sarah's situation. She wasn't just gathering information about the Crimson Riders, she was actively participating in planning and carrying out crimes. The moral complexity of her position was staggering. Later that night, as the outlaws settled down to sleep, Sarah approached Jake where he sat with his back against a boulder, still pretending to be tied up. "I know what you're thinking," she said quietly, sitting down beside him. "Do you?" Jake asked, keeping his voice low so the sleeping outlaws wouldn't hear. "You're wondering how I can live with myself, planning robberies and putting innocent people in danger?" Jake was quiet for a moment. "The thought had crossed my mind." Sarah was silent for a long time, staring up at the stars visible through the canyon opening above them. "Every night I ask myself the same question. But then I think about the bigger picture. The families being driven off their land, the native tribes being slaughtered for their territories, the corruption that's poisoning the entire territorial government. And that makes it worth it?" "I hope so," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I have to believe it does, or I don't know how I'll be able to look at myself in the mirror when this is all over." Jake could hear the pain in her voice, and he realized that Sarah's undercover work was costing her more than he had initially understood. She was sacrificing not just her safety, but her moral peace of mind, for what she believed was a greater good. "How long have you been doing this?" Jake asked. 8 months. The Pinkerton agency recruited me right after I finished teachers' college in Boston. They needed someone who could infiltrate criminal organizations in the West, someone who could blend in but also had the education and skills to gather intelligence. "And Judge Whitman is my supervisor and handler. He's been feeding me information about legal proceedings, property transfers, and political corruption that helps me understand how the conspiracy works." Jake shook his head in amazement. "It's incredible. And dangerous as hell." Sarah turned to look at him, her green eyes reflecting the starlight. "Jake, I need you to know something. Everything I said to you in Deadwood Gulch, all the conversations we had, the way I felt about you, that was real. That wasn't part of my cover." Jake felt his heart skip a beat. "Sarah, I know this complicates everything. I know you probably don't know what to think about me now. But I needed you to know that my feelings for you were never fake." Before Jake could respond, a sound from across the canyon made them both freeze. Someone was moving around the camp, trying to be quiet but not quite succeeding. Jake and Sarah watched as a figure crept toward the horses. It was Tommy the Kid, Wilson, and he appeared to be trying to steal one of the horses. But why would one of the gang members be trying to escape? Jake and Sarah exchanged glances, both thinking the same thing. Something was very wrong. Sarah moved with the silent grace of a trained agent, slipping through the shadows to get closer to Tommy. Jake, his hands now free from the loosely tied ropes, followed carefully behind her. They watched as Tommy reached into his saddlebags and pulled out something that made Sarah gasp softly. It was a badge, a federal marshal's badge. Tommy Wilson wasn't just an 18-year-old outlaw. He was an undercover federal agent, just like Sarah. But if that was true, why was he trying to escape? And why hadn't the Pinkerton agency told Sarah about another agent working the same case? As they watched, Tommy mounted his horse and began to ride quietly out of the canyon. Sarah made a quick decision and whistled softly, a sound that could have been made by a night bird. Tommy's horse stopped, and the young man turned in his saddle, his hand moving toward his gun. "Easy, kid," Sarah said, stepping out of the shadows. We need to talk. Tommy's eyes went wide when he saw Sarah without her red bandana mask. You're a woman. And you're a federal marshal, Sarah replied. The question is, what are we going to do about it? The three unlikely allies sat in a hidden alcove of the canyon, far enough from the sleeping outlaws to talk without being overheard. Tommy Wilson, it turned out, was actually Deputy U.S. Marshal Thomas Williamson, working undercover to investigate the same conspiracy that Sarah was pursuing for the Pinkerton Agency. I've been tracking this for over a year, Tommy explained, his youthful face serious in the moonlight. It started when several homesteaders in Nebraska were murdered, and their land was immediately claimed by a mining company with connections to territorial politicians. Jake listened as the two federal agents compared notes. The scope of the corruption was even larger than either of them had realized. The conspiracy involved not just stealing land, but manipulating territorial laws, bribing judges, and using private armies to intimidate or eliminate anyone who got in their way. The problem is, Tommy continued, I think someone suspects me. Coleman's been asking a lot of questions, and Mary Cassidy keeps watching me like she knows something. Sarah nodded grimly. I've noticed it too. And there's something else. The gold shipment we're supposed to rob in 3 days? I think it might be a trap. What do you mean? Jake asked. The information came too easily. Usually, I have to work to get intelligence about targets. This time, Coleman just happened to overhear a conversation about the shipment. It felt staged. Tommy's face went pale. If it's a trap, they could be planning to eliminate anyone they suspect of being a federal agent. Or, Sarah said thoughtfully, they could be planning to use the robbery as a way to advance their larger agenda. Think about it, a big violent robbery that kills several guards and steals $20,000 worth of gold would give the territorial government an excuse to crack down hard on settlers and mining camps. They could declare martial law, suspend normal legal protections, and use military force to drive people off their land. Jake was beginning to understand the full complexity of what they were dealing with. So what do we do? Sarah and Tommy looked at each other, both agents clearly thinking through their options. Finally, Sarah spoke. We go through with the robbery, but we control it. We make sure no one gets killed, we don't actually steal the gold, and we use the opportunity to gather evidence about who's really behind this conspiracy. That's incredibly dangerous, Jake pointed out. If Coleman and the others suspect anything, they'll kill us all, Tommy finished. But if we don't act, innocent people are going to die, and the real criminals will never be brought to justice. Jake looked at Sarah, seeing the determination in her green eyes. This was the woman he had fallen in love with, but she was also a federal agent willing to risk everything for justice. He made his decision. Then I'm in. All the way. Sarah smiled at him, an expression of gratitude and something deeper. Thank you, Jake. I know this isn't what you signed up for when you became sheriff. Maybe not, Jake replied. But it's the right thing to do. The next morning, the gang prepared to move to a new location closer to Devil's Canyon, where they would wait for the gold shipment. Jake noticed that Coleman kept watching Tommy with suspicious eyes, and Mary Cassidy seemed to be studying Sarah more carefully than usual. As they rode through the rugged landscape of the Badlands, Jake found himself thinking about the history of this land. Just a few years earlier, this had been territory controlled by the Lakota Sioux, led by chiefs like Red Cloud and Crazy Horse. The discovery of gold in the Black Hills had brought thousands of white settlers and miners, leading to conflicts that were still ongoing. The corruption that Sarah and Tommy were investigating was part of a larger pattern of exploitation and violence that had characterized the settlement of the American West. Native tribes, settlers, miners, and ranchers were all caught up in struggles over land and resources, while powerful interests manipulated the situation for their own profit. As they made camp that evening in a hidden valley, Jake noticed increased tension among the gang members. Coleman and Iron Pete were having whispered conversations, and Mary Cassidy was cleaning her weapons with unusual care. Something was definitely wrong. Sarah must have sensed it too, because she announced that she was going to scout the area around Devil's Canyon personally. She asked Jake to come with her, claiming that she wanted to use his knowledge of the local terrain. Once they were away from the camp, Sarah's carefully controlled facade dropped, and Jake could see the fear in her eyes. Jake, I think they're going to move against us tonight. Coleman's been acting strange all day, and I overheard Mary talking about cleaning house before the big job. Do you think they know you're a Pinkerton agent? I don't know. Maybe they just suspect that I'm not who I claim to be. But either way, we're in danger. Jake thought quickly. What about Tommy? I tried to signal him, but he's being watched too closely. If we try to warn him directly, it could expose all of us. They were trapped in a deadly situation. If they tried to flee, they would abandon their mission and leave Tommy in mortal danger. If they returned to camp, they might be walking into an ambush. There's another option, Jake said slowly. What? We turn the tables. We expose Coleman and the others before they can move against us. Sarah stared at him. How? Jake's mind was racing, putting together everything he had learned about the gang and their operations. Coleman's been too eager about this gold shipment robbery. What if he's not just suspicious of us? What if he's working directly for the conspiracy? What if his job is to eliminate any gang members who might know too much? Sarah's eyes widened as she understood what Jake was suggesting. You think Coleman is planning to kill his own gang after the robbery? Think about it. The Crimson Riders have been successful for months, but they've also been getting more attention from law enforcement. If the conspiracy leaders want to cover their tracks, they might decide it's time to eliminate the gang entirely. And blame their deaths on a gun battle with law enforcement during the robbery, Sarah finished. It would tie up all the loose ends and give them martyrs to use for propaganda purposes. As they talked, Jake and Sarah developed a desperate plan. They would return to camp and confront Coleman directly, hoping to expose his true loyalties and turn the other gang members against him. It was incredibly risky, but it might be their only chance to save Tommy and complete their mission. When they rode back into camp, they found the gang gathered around the fire, but the atmosphere was tense and dangerous. Coleman was standing with his hand resting on his gun, while Iron Pete and Mary flanked him on either side. Tommy was sitting by himself, clearly aware that he was in trouble but trying not to show it. Well, Shadow, Coleman said as Sarah and Jake dismounted. Have a nice little scouting trip? Very productive, Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the danger. I learned some interesting things about tomorrow's job. Such as? Sarah walked slowly toward the fire, her hands visible but ready to draw her weapons. Such as the fact that there is no gold shipment. Such as the fact that this whole thing is a setup designed to get us all killed. The camp erupted into chaos as guns were drawn and accusations flew. But Jake and Sarah were ready, and their desperate gamble was about to determine not just their fate, but the future of justice in the Dakota Territory. The confrontation around the campfire was like a deadly game of poker, with lives instead of money as the stakes. Coleman's hand was steady on his gun, but Jake could see uncertainty in his eyes. The outlaw leader hadn't expected to be challenged so directly. That's a serious accusation, Shadow, Coleman said, his voice low and dangerous. You better be able to back it up. Sarah stepped into the firelight, her green eyes reflecting the flames. I can back it up, Bart. The question is, are you going to try to kill us all now, or wait until tomorrow when you were supposed to spring your trap? Miguel Santos shifted nervously, his hand moving toward his weapon. What are you talking about, Shadow? I'm talking about the fact that Coleman here isn't really one of us, Sarah replied. He's working for the same people who've been using the Crimson Riders as their private army. Tommy chose that moment to speak up, his young voice carrying surprising authority. She's right. I've been watching Coleman for weeks. He's been sending messages to someone outside the gang. Iron Pete McAllister, the giant of a man, looked confused and angry. Coleman, is this true? Don't listen to them, Pete, Coleman snarled. Can't you see what's happening? The Shadow and the Kid are federal agents. They've been playing us from the beginning. Mary Cassidy laughed harshly. Now that's interesting. So we've got federal agents accusing each other of being traitors. This is better than a dime novel. Jake realized the situation was about to explode into violence. He stepped forward, his hands raised but ready to draw his weapons. There's an easy way to settle this, he said. Coleman claims Sarah and Tommy are federal agents. Sarah claims Coleman is working for the enemy. Why don't we let Coleman prove his loyalty? How? Coleman demanded. Jake smiled grimly. Simple. If you're really one of us, then you won't mind if we change the target for tomorrow's job. Instead of hitting a gold shipment that may or may not exist, we hit something else. Something that would really hurt the people you claim to be fighting against. Sarah caught on immediately. The land office in Rapid City. All the records of property transfers, mining claims, and territorial grants are kept there. Destroying those records would throw the whole territorial government into chaos. Coleman's face went pale. Hitting the land office would indeed damage the conspiracy he was secretly working for, something he couldn't allow to happen. That's crazy, he said. The land office is too well guarded. We'd never get out alive. Since when has Bart Coleman been afraid of a fight? Tommy asked pointedly. The other gang members were beginning to look suspicious. Iron Pete had always prided himself on his courage, and Miguel was known for taking impossible risks. If Coleman was backing down from a dangerous job, it suggested he had reasons beyond simple caution. "I say we do it," Iron Pete declared. "Burn the whole place down and show these territorial politicians that we can't be bought or intimidated." Mary Cassidy nodded agreement. "I like it. Much more satisfying than just stealing money." Coleman realized he was trapped. If he continued to object, he would expose himself as a traitor to the gang. But if he agreed to attack the land office, he would be working against his real employers. "Fine," he said finally. "But we stick to the original plan for now. After we get the gold tomorrow, we'll think about hitting the land office." It was a delaying tactic, but Jake could see that Coleman was planning something desperate. The outlaw leader's eyes kept flicking toward Mary Cassidy, and Jake suspected the two of them were working together. As the gang settled down for the night, Jake found himself assigned to take the first watch with Miguel Santos. The former vaquero was a man of few words, but he had always struck Jake as more honorable than the other outlaws. "Miguel," Jake said quietly as they sat watching the approaches to the camp, "what do you know about Coleman's background?" Miguel was silent for a long moment. "He joined us about 4 months ago. Said he was running from the law in Colorado. But I always wondered why a man with his reputation would want to join up with a gang instead of working alone." "What do you mean?" "Coleman's supposed to be one of the best gunfighters in 3 territories. Men like that don't usually take orders from anyone. They make their own way." Jake nodded thoughtfully. "Unless they're working for someone else all along." "Exactly." Miguel paused, then continued. "There's something else. I followed Coleman one night when he said he was going hunting. He met with a man in a fancy suit, someone who definitely wasn't an outlaw. They talked for about an hour, and when Coleman came back, he had a lot of money." This confirmed Jake's suspicions about Coleman's true loyalties. But it also meant that the situation was even more dangerous than they had realized. If Coleman was reporting to his handlers, then the conspiracy leaders knew about the federal agents working undercover with the gang. When Miguel's watch ended, Jake was replaced by Tommy. The young marshal looked worried but determined. "Jake," Tommy whispered, "I think we need to make our move tonight. I overheard Coleman talking to Mary. They're planning to kill Sarah in her sleep and make it look like she tried to escape." Jake felt cold anger wash over him. "When?" "Soon. Mary's going to create a distraction while Coleman does the deed. Then they'll claim Sarah was a traitor who tried to run off with information about the gang." Jake looked toward where Sarah was sleeping, wrapped in her bedroll near the dying campfire. She looked peaceful and vulnerable, nothing like the dangerous outlaw leader the gang believed her to be. "We have to warn her," Jake said. "I know. But if we move too obviously, Coleman will know we're onto him. We need to be smart about this." Jake thought quickly. "Can you create a distraction of your own? Something to wake everyone up without making it obvious?" Tommy nodded. "I'll accidentally kick some rocks down the canyon wall. Make it sound like someone's approaching the camp." "Good. When you do, I'll make sure Sarah gets the message." Tommy crept away to his position, and Jake waited tensely for the signal. A few minutes later, the sound of falling rocks echoed through the canyon, followed by Tommy's urgent shout. "Someone's coming. Everyone up." The camp erupted into activity as the gang members grabbed their weapons and took defensive positions. In the chaos, Jake was able to reach Sarah's side and quickly explain the situation. "Coleman and Mary?" she asked, instantly alert. "Tonight. We need to turn this around fast." Sarah's mind was already working. "Follow my lead," she said, then raised her voice so the whole gang could hear. "Miguel, Pete, Tommy, I want you 3 with me. Coleman, you and Mary guard the horses. If this is a law enforcement raid, we might need to ride out fast." It was a brilliant move. By separating Coleman and Mary from the other gang members, Sarah had neutralized their immediate threat while making it seem like a tactical decision. But Coleman wasn't fooled. "I think we should stick together, Shadow. Splitting up the gang is exactly what Lawmen would want us to do." "Are you questioning my orders, Coleman?" Sarah's voice carried a dangerous edge that made several gang members tense up. This was the moment of truth. Coleman had to either back down and accept Sarah's authority, or challenge her directly for leadership of the gang. Jake could see the outlaw weighing his options, his hand hovering near his gun. "Maybe it's time for new leadership," Coleman said finally. "I'm tired of taking orders from someone who might not have the gang's best interests at heart." The camp fell silent. A challenge to the leader's authority was serious business among outlaws. Such disputes were usually settled with guns, and everyone knew it. "You think you can do better?" Sarah asked, stepping into the moonlight where everyone could see her clearly. I know I can. And I think the boys here deserve to know the truth about who you really are. Jake realized that Coleman was about to expose Sarah's identity as a federal agent. Once that happened, even the gang members who liked her would turn against her. There was only one way to stop him. Coleman's right about one thing, Jake said, stepping forward. You all deserve to know the truth. But not the truth about Sarah. The truth about him. Coleman spun toward Jake, his hand moving for his gun. Shut up, Morrison. The truth is that Coleman's been working for the same people who've been using this gang. The same people who want to steal land from settlers and Indians. He's not an outlaw, he's a hired killer sent to control you and eventually eliminate you. Iron Pete's massive form straightened up in anger. Coleman, you son of a bitch. Is that true? Instead of answering, Coleman drew his gun with lightning speed. But Jake had been expecting it, and his own Colt cleared leather a split second later. The two guns fired almost simultaneously, the reports echoing off the canyon walls like thunder. Coleman's bullet whistled past Jake's ear, close enough to burn. Jake's shot took Coleman in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his gun flying into the darkness. But before anyone could react, Mary Cassidy had drawn her own weapon and was pointing it at Sarah's head. Nobody move. Mary shouted. Or the lady gets a bullet in the brain. The standoff was deadly tense. Tommy had his gun trained on Mary, but she was using Sarah as a human shield. Miguel and Iron Pete were both armed and ready, but confused about who to trust. Mary, Jake said carefully, you don't want to do this. Think about it, Coleman was ready to sell out the whole gang. Are you really going to die for him? Shut up. Mary's voice was high with panic and anger. You don't know anything about anything. I know that you and Coleman have been planning to kill everyone here, Sarah said calmly, despite having a gun pressed to her head. I know that you're both working for people who see the Crimson Riders as expendable tools. That's not true. Then prove it, Tommy said, his young voice steady. Let Sarah go and we'll all ride out of here together. No one else has to die. For a moment, it seemed like Mary might accept the offer. But then Coleman, despite his wounded shoulder, managed to grab a spare gun from his belt with his left hand. Kill them all, he screamed, raising the weapon toward Jake. The canyon erupted in gunfire as everyone began shooting at once. Jake dove for cover behind a boulder, drawing his second gun as bullets whined overhead. Sarah broke free from Mary's grip and rolled behind the campfire, coming up with both her revolvers blazing. Miguel and Iron Pete, realizing that Coleman and Mary had indeed been planning to betray the gang, joined the fight against the two traitors. Tommy, despite his youth, showed the steady nerves of a trained lawman as he methodically targeted the real enemies. The gun battle was brief but intense. When the smoke cleared, Coleman lay dead with 3 bullets in his chest. Mary Cassidy was wounded but alive, clutching a shattered arm and cursing everyone within earshot. It's over, Sarah announced, standing in the moonlight with her gun still drawn. Coleman and Mary were working for the same people who've been manipulating all of us. Iron Pete looked down at Coleman's body with disgust. I should have seen it sooner. The bastard was always too eager to take risks with other people's lives. Miguel nodded agreement. What do we do now, Shadow? Sarah looked around at the surviving gang members, Miguel, Iron Pete, and Tommy. All of them were looking to her for leadership, unaware that she was actually a federal agent. Now we finish what we started, she said. But we do it right. No more innocent people getting killed. No more working for men in suits who see us as disposable. Jake understood what Sarah was doing. She was transforming the Crimson Riders from a tool of the conspiracy into a force that could actually work for justice. It was a dangerous gamble, but it might be their only chance to complete their mission. What about the sheriff? Iron Pete asked, nodding toward Jake. He's with us now, Sarah replied. Jake Morrison has seen what we're really fighting against. Haven't you, Jake? Jake nodded, playing his part in Sarah's improvised plan. The law isn't always on the side of justice. Sometimes you have to work outside it to do what's right. The surviving members of the Crimson Riders spent the rest of the night planning their next move. With Coleman dead and Mary wounded and captured, the gang's dynamics had completely changed. Sarah was now the undisputed leader, but she was walking a dangerous line between her role as a federal agent and her cover as an outlaw. As dawn broke over the Badlands, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Jake found himself thinking about how much his life had changed in just a few days. He had started as a sheriff pursuing outlaws, and now he was part of a conspiracy to expose corruption at the highest levels of territorial government. Jake, Sarah said quietly, sitting down beside him as he watched the sunrise. I know this isn't what you signed up for. No, Jake agreed. But it's what needs to be done. I've seen too much corruption in my time as sheriff, judges who could be bought, politicians who cared more about money than justice, law enforcement officers who worked for whoever paid them best. Sarah nodded. That's exactly why the Pinkerton agency recruited me for this job. The corruption goes so deep that normal law enforcement can't touch it. What happens after we expose the conspiracy? Do you go back to being Sarah Whitman, the schoolteacher? Sarah was quiet for a long moment. I don't know. I've been living this double life for so long, I'm not sure who the real Sarah is anymore. Jake looked at her, seeing both the refined Eastern lady he had fallen in love with and the dangerous outlaw leader she had become. I know who you are, he said simply. You're someone who's willing to sacrifice everything for justice. That's the woman I fell in love with. Before Sarah could respond, Tommy approached them with urgent news. We've got visitors, he said, pointing toward the canyon entrance. Riders coming in fast. Jake and Sarah grabbed their weapons and joined Miguel and Iron Pete at defensive positions overlooking the narrow entrance to their hidden valley. What they saw made Jake's blood run cold. It was a large group of armed men, at least 20 riders wearing the badges of territorial marshals. But Jake recognized several of them as hired gunmen and known criminals. This wasn't a legitimate law enforcement operation. It was a private army sent by the conspiracy. Looks like Coleman got word to his bosses before we stopped him, Sarah muttered. Leading the group was a man Jake recognized, Deputy Territorial Marshal William Hayes, a corrupt lawman who was rumored to be on the payroll of several mining companies. Hayes was a thin, cruel-faced man who enjoyed inflicting pain and had killed more than a dozen men in self-defense. Shadow. Hayes called out, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. We know you're in there. Come out now and we might let some of your people live. Sarah looked at her companions Jake, Tommy, Miguel, and Iron Pete. 5 people against 20 armed men in an enclosed canyon. The odds were not good. What do you want to do? Miguel asked. Sarah's mind was racing, weighing options. They could surrender and hope to be taken alive, but that would mean abandoning their mission and probably dying anyway once Hayes realized who they really were. They could try to fight their way out, but that would likely result in everyone getting killed. There's a third option, Jake said quietly. We tell them the truth. What do you mean? I mean we expose the whole conspiracy right here, right now. Hayes is working for the same people Coleman was. If we can prove that, we might be able to turn this around. Sarah understood what Jake was suggesting. You want to reveal that I'm a Pinkerton agent? I want to reveal that Hayes is a criminal pretending to be a lawman, and that the territorial government is so corrupt that federal agents have to work undercover to gather evidence. It was incredibly risky, but Sarah realized it might be their only chance. She stood up and called out to Hayes. Marshal Hayes. I want to talk. Just you and me, no weapons. Hayes laughed harshly. You're not in a position to negotiate, Shadow? Actually, I am. Sarah replied. Because I have information that your bosses really don't want to become public. There was a long silence. Finally, Hayes dismounted and began walking toward the canyon, his hands visible but close to his weapons. Sarah climbed down from the rocks and met him in the open area near the entrance. Jake and the others kept their weapons trained on Hayes and his men, ready for trouble. So what's this information you think is so valuable? Hayes demanded. I know about the land fraud, Sarah said simply. I know about the forged documents, the bribes to judges and politicians, the private armies being used to intimidate settlers. I know everything. Hayes' face went pale. You're bluffing. Am I? Then why are you here with 20 gunmen instead of a couple of deputy marshals? Why did Coleman have to be eliminated when he started getting careless? Why are mining companies getting land grants for territories that are supposed to be protected Indian reservations? You can't prove any of that. Sarah smiled coldly. Actually, I can. Because for the past 8 months, I've been gathering evidence as an undercover agent for the Pinkerton Detective Agency. The revelation hit Hayes like a physical blow. He staggered backward, his hand moving instinctively toward his gun. You're lying. Detective Sarah McKenna, Pinkerton Agency, working under federal authorization, Sarah said clearly, loud enough for all of Hayes' men to hear. And you, Marshal Hayes, are under arrest for conspiracy, corruption, and murder. The standoff was now completely transformed. Hayes' men were looking at each other uncertainly, realizing that they had been sent to kill a federal agent. Some of them were genuine lawmen who had been lied to about the situation. Others were hired killers who didn't care about the legalities but were smart enough to know that murdering a Pinkerton agent would bring down the full weight of the federal government on their heads. She's lying. Hayes screamed. She's an outlaw and a killer. Don't listen to her. But Tommy chose that moment to reveal his own identity. Deputy U.S. Marshal Thomas Williamson, he called out, showing his badge. I can confirm Agent McKenna's identity and authority. Jake stepped forward as well. Sheriff Jake Morrison of Deadwood Gulch. I've been working with these federal agents to investigate the corruption in the territorial government. Hayes was now completely trapped. 3 of the people he had come to kill or capture were actually law enforcement officers working on a federal investigation. His own men were beginning to back away from him, unwilling to be part of what was now clearly an illegal operation. This is insane. Hayes snarled. You expect me to believe that the famous outlaw gang the Crimson Riders is actually a federal law enforcement operation? Not exactly, Sarah replied. The Crimson Riders were a real outlaw gang, but they were being manipulated by the same conspiracy we've been investigating. Most of the gang members didn't know they were working for corrupt politicians and business interests. She gestured toward Miguel and Iron Pete. These men thought they were fighting against an unjust system. They didn't realize they were being used by the very people who created that injustice. Miguel stepped forward, his face grim with understanding. Agent McKenna, are you saying that everything we've done, all the robberies and violence, it was all part of someone else's plan? I'm afraid so, Miguel. The conspiracy leaders wanted to create chaos and lawlessness as an excuse to bring in private armies and suspend normal legal protections. Every crime the Crimson Riders committed gave them more justification for their oppression. Iron Pete's massive hands clenched into fists. Those bastards used us. They made us into the very thing we thought we were fighting against. Hayes, seeing his support crumbling, made a desperate move. He drew his gun and pointed it at Sarah. I don't care if you're a federal agent or the Queen of England, he snarled. You've caused too much trouble to be allowed to live. But before he could pull the trigger, Jake's Colt spoke with deadly authority. Hayes dropped his gun and clutched his chest, blood spreading across his shirt. He fell to his knees, then onto his face in the dirt. The rest of Hayes' men, seeing their leader dead and realizing they had been part of an illegal operation, began to surrender. Several of the legitimate lawmen among them actually thanked Sarah and Tommy for exposing the corruption they had suspected but couldn't prove. The aftermath of the showdown in Devil's Canyon marked the beginning of the end for the conspiracy that had plagued the Dakota Territory. With Hayes dead and several of his men willing to testify about the illegal activities they had witnessed, Sarah and Tommy finally had the evidence they needed to bring down the network of corrupt officials and business interests. Over the next several weeks, a series of arrests swept through the territorial government. Judge Harrison, who had been taking bribes to approve fraudulent land transfers, was arrested along with 3 other judges. Senator Morrison, no relation to Jake, was exposed as having received thousands of dollars in bribes from mining companies. The Territorial Land Commissioner was found to have issued grants for over 1 million acres of land that legally belonged to Native American tribes. The scandal reached all the way to Washington, D.C., where several congressmen and federal officials were implicated in the land fraud scheme. The Pinkerton Agency's investigation, led by Sarah's undercover work, was praised by President Ulysses S. Grant himself as a model of federal law enforcement. But for the individuals involved, the victory came at a personal cost. Miguel Santos and Iron Pete McAllister faced the difficult process of accounting for their crimes as members of the Crimson Riders. Both men had killed people during robberies, even if they had been manipulated into doing so. However, their cooperation with the federal investigation and their testimony against the conspiracy leaders earned them reduced sentences. Miguel was sentenced to 5 years in prison but was released after 3 for good behavior. Iron Pete, whose crimes were more serious, served 7 years but eventually became a respected rancher in Montana. Mary Cassidy, who had been wounded in the final gun battle, chose to cooperate fully with federal investigators rather than face execution for her crimes. Her information helped expose several other criminal networks operating throughout the West. She was sentenced to 15 years in prison but was released after 10 years and disappeared into obscurity. Tommy Williamson was promoted to full U.S. Marshal and was assigned to continue rooting out corruption in territorial governments throughout the West. His youthful appearance and ability to go undercover made him one of the most effective federal agents of his era. For Sarah and Jake, the end of the conspiracy meant facing the question of their future together. I've been offered a permanent position with the Pinkerton Agency, Sarah told Jake as they sat on the porch of the small house she had rented in Deadwood Gulch under her real identity. They want me to head up their Western operations. Jake nodded thoughtfully. It's important work. You've probably saved thousands of lives by exposing that conspiracy. But it would mean more undercover assignments, more time away, more deception and danger. Jake looked at the woman he loved, seeing both the federal agent and the schoolteacher in her green eyes. "What do you want to do?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. "I want to make a difference. I want to fight against corruption and injustice. But I also want to have a real life with people who know who I really am." "You could do both," Jake suggested. "The Pinkerton Agency could use a regional office here in the Dakota Territory. You could train other agents, coordinate investigations, and work on cases without having to go undercover for months at a time." Sarah's face lit up with possibility. "And I could still teach school. The children in Deadwood Gulch need education if this territory is ever going to become a civilized place." "There's something else," Jake said, reaching into his vest pocket and pulling out a small velvet box. "I was going to ask Judge Whitman for permission to court you, back when I thought he was your father. But since he's actually your supervisor, I figured I should ask you directly." Sarah stared at the engagement ring Jake was offering, her heart racing with joy and excitement. "Jake Morrison, are you asking me to marry you?" "I'm asking you to be my partner in every sense of the word. In life, in love, and in making sure justice prevails in this wild country we call home." Sarah's answer was to kiss him with all the passion and love she had been hiding during her months of deception and danger. They were married 6 months later in a ceremony that brought together an unusual collection of guests. Judge Whitman, Sarah's Pinkerton supervisor, gave the bride away. Tommy Williamson served as Jake's best man. Even Miguel Santos, on leave from prison for good behavior, attended the wedding. The ceremony was held in the new schoolhouse that Sarah had built with some of the reward money from the conspiracy investigation. The building served as both a school and a community center for the growing town of Deadwood Gulch, which was evolving from a wild mining camp into a legitimate settlement. Years later, when the Dakota Territory had become the states of North and South Dakota, and when the Wild West was becoming more of a memory than a reality, people would still tell stories about the Crimson Riders and the conspiracy that nearly destroyed the frontier's promise of freedom and opportunity. Children who had learned to read in Sarah Morrison's schoolhouse would grow up to become teachers, doctors, lawyers, and leaders who remembered the lessons about justice and courage they had learned from their remarkable teacher. They would pass those stories on to their own children, creating a legacy that would outlast any individual life. Jake Morrison served as sheriff of Deadwood Gulch for another 15 years, becoming known throughout the region for his fairness and integrity. He and Sarah worked together on several more cases involving corruption and crime, with Sarah serving as a special consultant to the Pinkerton Agency while maintaining her cover as a schoolteacher and sheriff's wife. Tommy Williamson eventually became the territorial U.S. Marshal for Montana, where he continued his fight against organized crime and corruption until his retirement. He never married, claiming that his work was too dangerous for a family life, but he remained close friends with Jake and Sarah throughout his life. Miguel Santos became a successful rancher and community leader in Montana, using his experiences with the Crimson Riders as cautionary tales for young people tempted by crime. He established a fund to help reformed criminals start new lives, believing that people could change if given the opportunity. Iron Pete McAllister also found redemption after his release from prison, becoming a blacksmith and eventually the mayor of a small town in Wyoming. His enormous strength, once used for violence, was channeled into building homes, schools, and churches for settlers. The conspiracy that had nearly corrupted the entire Dakota Territory became a landmark case in federal law enforcement, leading to new policies and procedures for investigating organized corruption. The Pinkerton Agency's methods, refined through cases like Sarah's undercover work, became the model for federal investigations throughout the American West. But perhaps most importantly, the story of Sarah McKenna Morrison and Jake Morrison became a legend that captured the true spirit of the American frontier, a land where people could reinvent themselves, where justice was worth fighting for, and where love could flourish even in the shadows of danger and deception. The prairie grass still waves in the wind across the Dakotas, and if you know where to look, you can still find traces of the old trails where the Crimson Riders once traveled. Local historians will tell you about the hidden canyon where the final showdown took place, and the schoolhouse in Deadwood Gulch where Sarah Morrison taught generations of children about the importance of truth, courage, and justice. The Wild West was a time and place where ordinary people did extraordinary things, where the line between hero and villain was sometimes blurred, and where the promise of America, that anyone could make a new life based on their choices rather than their circumstances, was tested daily in the harsh realities of frontier life. Sarah and Jake Morrison's story reminds us that the most important battles are often fought not with guns and horses, but with courage and integrity. Their love story, forged in the crucible of danger and deception, proved that even in the darkest shadows, love and justice can prevail. The blood on the prairie has long since washed away with the rains of countless seasons. But the love that grew in those shadows and the justice that triumphed over corruption continues to inspire new generations of Americans who believe in the promise of a land where freedom and opportunity are not just words, but ideals worth fighting for. In the end, that may be the most important lesson of the Wild West, not that it was a time of lawlessness and violence, but that it was a time when people like Sarah and Jake Morrison proved that ordinary individuals could make an extraordinary difference in the struggle between right and wrong, between corruption and justice, between despair and hope. The legend of blood on the prairie, love in the shadows lives on, reminding us that the American frontier was shaped not just by gunfighters and outlaws, but by people who believed that love and justice could triumph over even the darkest forces of corruption and evil. Their story is our story, and their legacy continues to inspire us to fight for what is right, no matter how difficult the battle may be.